In the mountains of Afghanistan, where death whispers through every canyon and survival depends on split-second decisions, Marcus Kane learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one you can see. It's the silence that comes before everything changes forever. What started as a routine reconnaissance mission in 2018 became a test of everything he believed about honor, duty, and the thin line between justice and vengeance. When Taliban forces surrounded his team in a remote valley, and his spotter lay bleeding beside him, Marcus faced a choice that would haunt him for years. The weapon in his hands wasn't just a rifle. It was the weight of every life he'd taken, every brother he'd lost, and every promise he'd made to come home alive. But in that moment of perfect silence, before chaos erupted and changed everything, Marcus Kane had to decide what kind of warrior he truly was. This is the story of 3 days that transformed a decorated Navy SEAL sniper from a precision instrument of war into something far more complex. It's about brotherhood forged in fire, the cost of survival, and the moment when a battle-hardened soldier discovered that the hardest battles aren't always fought with bullets. Some stories are about heroes. Others are about the price of becoming one. This is both. Marcus Kane pressed his eye to the scope, the familiar weight of his rifle steady against his shoulder. Through the crosshairs, the Afghan valley stretched below, like a brown scar carved into the earth. 3 years into his 4th deployment, he'd learned to read the landscape like scripture. Every ridge could hide an enemy. Every shadow might conceal death. Movement, 2 o'clock, whispered Danny Rodriguez, his spotter, lying beside him in the rocky outcrop they'd claimed as their nest. The 24-year-old kid from El Paso had been with Marcus for 8 months now, long enough to know when to speak and when to stay silent. Marcus adjusted his position slightly, scanning the area Danny indicated. Below them, the village of Karasmir looked peaceful in the morning light. Mud brick houses clustered around a dry riverbed, like sleeping animals. Somewhere in that maze of walls and alleyways, intelligence suggested was Ahmed Khalil, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition supply routes. "I see him," Marcus murmured, spotting a figure in traditional Afghan clothing moving between buildings. "But it's not our target. They'd been in position for 6 hours, since before dawn. Their 4-man team had inserted via helicopter 12 clicks away, then hiked through treacherous mountain terrain to reach this overwatch position. Sergeants Williams and Patterson were positioned 300 meters to their east, covering the village's main escape route." Marcus shifted his weight, feeling the familiar ache in his left shoulder, where Taliban shrapnel had found him 2 deployments ago. At 32, he was older than most snipers, but experience had taught him patience that younger shooters lacked. He'd made over 60 confirmed kills in his career, each one measured, necessary, clean. "Kane, this is Overlord," came the voice of their commanding officer through his earpiece. "Sit rep? Position secure." "No sign of Jackrabbit," Marcus replied, using Khalil's code name. "Village appears normal. Minimal civilian activity." "Copy that. Maintain Overwatch. Jackrabbit should be moving to the target building within the next 2 hours, based on our intelligence." Marcus acknowledged and settled in for the wait. Beside him, Danny methodically recorded wind speed and direction in his logbook. The kid was thorough. Marcus had to give him that. Reminded him of himself at that age, eager to prove himself worthy of the teams. "Sergeant Kane," Danny said quietly, "can I ask you something?" Marcus kept his eye on the scope but nodded slightly. "How do you do it? I mean, when you have to take the shot, how do you just switch off?" It was a question Marcus had been asked before, by younger soldiers who saw killing as either the ultimate test of manhood or the destruction of their souls. The truth was more complicated than either extreme. "You don't switch off," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "You switch on. Everything else disappears except the mission, the target, and protecting your team. The shot isn't about taking a life. It's about saving lives. The ones behind you, the ones counting on you to do your job." Danny was quiet for a moment. "My girlfriend back home, she asks me what I do over here. I never know what to tell her. Tell her you serve your country with honor. The rest stays here." A flash of movement in the village below caught Marcus's attention. A black sedan, unusual for this remote area, was making its way down the main road. He tracked it through his scope as it pulled up beside the target building, a 2-story structure that intelligence had identified as a Taliban safe house. "Danny, you seeing this?" "Got it. Recording time and position." 3 men emerged from the sedan. 2 were clearly bodyguards, Alaska 47s visible beneath their loose clothing. The third figure was smaller, wearing a Packle hat and walking with the careful dignity of someone accustomed to respect. Marcus studied the man's face through his scope. High cheekbones, graying beard, a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He'd memorized Khalil's photograph before the mission, and this matched perfectly. "Jackrabbit is in the building," Marcus reported to Overlord. "Confirmed. You are cleared to engage when you have a clean shot." Marcus settled deeper into his shooting position, controlling his breathing. The target building was 847 meters away, well within his effective range. Wind was minimal, maybe 3 miles per hour from the northwest. Temperature was rising with the morning sun, which would affect bullet trajectory slightly. 20 minutes passed. Then the door of the target building opened, and Ahmad Khalil stepped into the courtyard. Marcus placed the crosshairs on center mass of the Taliban commander's chest. His finger moved to the trigger guard, then to the trigger itself. One squeeze, and a man responsible for killing American soldiers would be eliminated, but something made him pause. Through his scope, Marcus watched as a small girl, maybe 6 years old, came running from one of the adjacent houses. She threw herself into Khalil's arms with the uninhibited joy of a child seeing her father. The Taliban commander spun her around, his stern face breaking into a genuine smile. "What's the hold-up, Kane?" Kane Overlord's voice. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He kept the crosshairs steady on Khalil, but his finger had moved back to the trigger guard. In his earpiece, he could hear Danny's breathing, steady and professional. "Child in the area," Marcus finally reported. Assessing safety of engagement. Through the scope, he watched Khalil set his daughter down and kneel to her level, straightening her headscarf with gentle hands. The man who ordered roadside bombs that killed American soldiers was kissing his little girl's forehead with tender affection. Marcus had killed men before, without hesitation, when the mission required it. Taliban fighters who were actively engaged in combat, bomb makers caught in the act, terrorist leaders isolated and presenting clear threats. But this felt different. "Kane, you have a clear shot. Take it." Overlord's voice was more insistent now. The child was still in the courtyard, but she'd moved several feet away from her father. The shot would be clean, minimal risk of collateral damage. Marcus knew Khalil was responsible for attacks that had killed at least 8 American soldiers in the past 6 months. This was why they were here. His finger returned to the trigger. Through the scope, he could see Khalil standing now, talking to one of his bodyguards, the perfect soldier's target. The crosshairs were steady on the center of the man's chest. Marcus began his breathing sequence. Inhale, exhale halfway, hold. On the natural respiratory pause, he would squeeze the trigger. Simple, clean, mission accomplished. But the little girl chose that moment to run back to her father, clutching his leg and pointing at something in the distance that had caught her attention. Khalil picked her up again, following her gaze toward the mountains where Marcus lay hidden. For a split second, through the magnification of his scope, Marcus felt like Khalil was looking directly at him. The Taliban commander's eyes seemed to hold a warning, as if he knew death was watching from the ridgeline. "Carney, take the goddamn shot." Overlord's voice crackled with authority. Marcus's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot angle was perfect. The range was confirmed. Everything was ready. Then the world exploded. The first mortar round hit 50 meters to their left, showering Marcus and Danny with rocks and dirt. The sharp crack of rifle fire echoed across the valley as Taliban fighters emerged from hidden positions throughout the village. "Contact! Contact!" Danny was shouting into his radio. "We are under effective enemy fire." Marcus rolled away from his rifle and grabbed his M4 carbine. Through the chaos, he could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions in the village below. The Taliban had known they were coming. This wasn't a routine sniper mission anymore. It was an ambush. "Williams, Patterson, report." Marcus called out to his teammates. Static answered him for several long seconds. Then Williams's voice came through, strained and urgent. "We're pinned down." "Patterson's hit. They've got us surrounded down here." Another mortar round hit closer this time. Close enough that Marcus felt the concussion wave. He grabbed Danny by the shoulder and pointed to a better position behind a larger rock formation. "Move. Now." They low-crawled across 20 meters of exposed ground while bullets snapped overhead. Marcus could hear the distinctive crack of trained marksmen among the random spray of automatic weapons fire. The Taliban had snipers of their own in these mountains. Behind the rocks, Marcus tried to assess their situation. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and caught in a carefully planned trap. Williams and Patterson were pinned down with one man wounded. The extraction helicopter wouldn't be able to land in this firefight. "Danny!" Get on the radio to Overlord. Tell him we need immediate close air support and emergency extraction. While Danny worked the radio, Marcus peered around the rocks toward the village. Through his rifle scope, he could still see the target building where Ahmad Khalil had been standing with his daughter. The courtyard was empty now. The Taliban commander had vanished, along with the child and his bodyguards. Marcus felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. They'd been set up. Someone had fed the Taliban information about their mission. Khalil had never been in danger. He'd been bait, and Marcus's team had walked straight into the trap. A bullet struck the rock inches from his head, sending stone fragments into his cheek. He wiped away blood and returned fire with his M4, not expecting to hit anything at this range, but hoping to keep the enemy marksman honest. Overlord's saying air support is 20 minutes out, Danny reported. Extraction bird can't come in until the area is secure. 20 minutes was a lifetime in a firefight. Marcus counted muzzle flashes and estimated they were facing at least 30 Taliban fighters, positioned in a classic L-shaped ambush formation. Professional work by an experienced enemy commander. The irony wasn't lost on him. Ahmad Khalil, the man he'd hesitated to kill while holding his daughter, had likely planned this entire operation. The little girl's presence in the courtyard had been calculated, designed to create exactly the moment of hesitation that had allowed the ambush to be triggered. Marcus had been played by a master tactician who understood that American soldiers had rules, boundaries, lines they wouldn't cross. Khalil had used Marcus's own humanity against him. Another mortar round exploded nearby, and Marcus heard Danny grunt in pain. The young spotter was clutching his left arm, blood seeping between his fingers. "How bad?" Marcus asked. "Shrapnel. I'm still good to fight." But Marcus could see that Danny was pale, probably losing more blood than he was admitting. They needed to end this firefight and get medical attention for their wounded. He keyed his radio again. "Williams, can you and Patterson move to higher ground?" "Negative. Patterson can't walk, and they've got every approach covered. We're stuck down here." Marcus studied the terrain around their position. They had decent cover but limited mobility. The Taliban fighters would eventually work their way closer, using fire and movement tactics to surround them completely. Unless something changed, this would become a fight to the death. He looked back toward the village through his scope, searching for the enemy commander he'd failed to eliminate. Somewhere down there, Ahmad Khalil was coordinating this attack, probably from the same building where Marcus had watched him embrace his daughter. The mission had been a failure from the moment Marcus hesitated to take the shot. Now 4 American soldiers were trapped in enemy territory, 2 of them wounded because he'd allowed human emotion to override tactical necessity. Marcus had been trained to compartmentalize, to separate the human cost of war from the strategic requirements of victory. For 8 years and 4 deployments, he'd maintained that separation successfully. But today, watching a father love his child, that wall had cracked. Now that crack might cost them all their lives. The firefight had been raging for 40 minutes when Marcus heard the sound that every soldier dreads, the high-pitched whine of an incoming rocket-propelled grenade. He grabbed Danny and pulled him deeper behind their rocky shelter just as the RPG exploded against the cliff face above them, raining down chunks of stone and metal fragments. "That was too close," Danny gasped, his wounded arm pressed against his chest. The young spotter's face was grey with pain and blood loss, but his eyes remained alert and focused. Marcus checked his ammunition. 3 magazines left for his M4, plus the rounds in his sniper rifle. Not enough for a prolonged engagement, especially against an enemy that seemed to have unlimited supplies and reinforcements arriving from the valley below. Through his earpiece, he could hear Williams coordinating with the wounded Patterson. Their voices tense but professional even under extreme pressure. The 2 sergeants were trapped in a depression near the village outskirts, taking fire from multiple directions while trying to keep Patterson alive until medical evacuation became possible. "Kane, this is Williams. Patterson's bleeding bad. That shrapnel hit an artery. I've got pressure on it, but he needs a corpsman now." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, calculating distances and risks. Williams and Patterson were 300 meters away, across exposed terrain that the Taliban had covered with overlapping fields of fire. Any rescue attempt would be suicide in daylight. "Hold tight, Williams. Air support should be here soon." But even as he said it, Marcus knew the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Taliban fighters weren't content to simply pin them down. They were maneuvering, using the rocky terrain to advance closer to both American positions. Soon they would have direct fire angles that would make their current cover positions untenable. Marcus studied the mountainside through his rifle scope, identifying enemy positions by muzzle flashes and movement. He counted at least 8 fighters working their way up the slope toward his and Danny's position. Below them, another dozen Taliban were moving to flank Williams and Patterson. "Danny, can you still spot for me?" The wounded soldier nodded grimly. "Give me targets." Marcus set up his rifle on the rocks and began engaging the closest threats. His first shot took down a Taliban fighter who had moved too far ahead of his supporting elements. The second shot forced another group to take cover behind a boulder, disrupting their advance. But for every enemy fighter he engaged, 2 more seemed to take their place. The Taliban commander, whoever was directing this operation, clearly had substantial resources at his disposal. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a carefully planned operation designed to capture or kill an American sniper team. "Kane, this is Overlord," came the voice from headquarters. "Apache gunships are inbound, ETA 10 minutes. Can you mark targets for close air support?" "Roger that," Marcus replied, though he wondered if they had 10 minutes left. As if reading his thoughts, Danny pointed toward the village below. "Movement on the road. Looks like more vehicles." Marcus swung his scope toward the main road and cursed under his breath. 3 more vehicles were approaching the village, each one packed with armed fighters. The Taliban weren't just trying to eliminate his team. They were turning this into a major engagement, possibly hoping to draw in additional American forces for a larger ambush. The tactical situation was becoming clear to Marcus now. Ahmed Khalil hadn't just used his daughter as human shield to prevent the assassination. He'd used the entire scenario to lure an elite American sniper team into a trap. The Taliban commander had sacrificed tactical surprise in order to capture or kill operators who had been causing significant damage to his network. It was a calculated risk that was paying off. Instead of losing one high-value target, the Taliban had the opportunity to eliminate 4 highly trained American soldiers and potentially capture sensitive equipment and intelligence. Marcus had to admire the tactical sophistication, even while cursing himself for falling into it. He'd been outmaneuvered by an enemy he'd underestimated, an enemy who understood American rules of engagement better than many Americans did. A bullet cracked past his head, close enough to feel the displaced air. The Taliban marksmen were getting more accurate as they closed the distance. Marcus returned fire, forcing the enemy shooter to duck behind cover. But he knew this was ultimately a losing game. "Danny, we need to move to a better position. This spot's going to be overrun soon." Danny looked around at their options. Above them, the mountainside was mostly bare rock with minimal cover. Below them lay the killing ground, where Williams and Patterson were already trapped. To their flanks, Taliban fighters were advancing through terrain that offered concealment and cover. "Where exactly did you have in mind?" Danny asked with dark humor. Before Marcus could answer, the radio crackled with Williams's voice, strained and desperate. "Kane, Patterson's unconscious. I'm running low on ammo. If those fighters get much closer, we're done." Marcus made a decision that went against every tactical principle he'd been taught. Instead of preserving his own position for the arrival of air support, he was going to create a diversion that might give Williams and Patterson a chance. "Danny, I need you to stay here and direct the Apache strikes when they arrive. Can you do that?" "Where are you going?" "Down there. Williams and Patterson need help, and I'm the only one who can provide it." Danny grabbed Marcus's arm with his good hand. "That's suicide, Sergeant. You'll never make it across that open ground." Marcus looked down at the terrain between their position and Williams' location. Danny was right. 300 meters of rocky slope with virtually no cover, all of it under observation by Taliban fighters with automatic weapons and marksmen. The odds of survival were minimal, but the odds of Williams and Patterson surviving without intervention were even worse. "You remember what I told you earlier about switching on?" Marcus asked. "This is one of those times." He handed Danny his sniper rifle. "If you get a clear shot at any high-value targets, take it. Don't hesitate like I did." Marcus checked his M4 carbine one more time, ensuring he had a full magazine. He also grabbed 2 fragmentation grenades from his vest, knowing he'd need every advantage in the fight ahead. When the Apaches arrived, direct them to hit the main concentration of fighters in the village first. That should draw attention away from Williams's position. "Sergeant Kane," Danny said quietly. "For what it's worth, I think you made the right call earlier. With the kid, I mean." Marcus paused in his preparations. "Why? Because we're supposed to be better than them. Even in war, especially in war." Marcus nodded slowly. Maybe Danny was right. Maybe preserving some sense of humanity was more important than tactical perfection. But that philosophical debate would have to wait. Right now, 2 American soldiers needed help, and Marcus was the only one in position to provide it. He took a deep breath and prepared to move. The first 30 meters would be the most dangerous, crossing completely open ground while Taliban fighters adjusted their fire to engage him. If he could reach the cluster of boulders halfway down the slope, he'd have temporary cover to assess the situation and plan his next move. Marcus sprinted from cover, immediately drawing intense fire from multiple directions. Bullets cracked and snapped around him as he zigzagged down the slope, using speed and unpredictable movement to avoid the accurate shots he knew were coming. 20 meters. The Taliban fighters were adjusting their aim, leading his movement more accurately. Marcus dove and rolled as a burst of automatic fire chewed up the ground where he'd been running. 30 meters. He reached the boulder cluster and slid behind the largest rock, breathing heavily. Several bullets had come close enough to tear holes in his uniform, but he was uninjured. From this position, Marcus could see Williams and Patterson clearly. Williams was crouched over his wounded teammate, applying pressure to a wound in Patterson's chest while trying to return fire with his sidearm. The sergeant's rifle lay beside him, apparently damaged by enemy fire. The Taliban fighters advancing on their position were only 50 meters away now, moving tactically from cover to cover. Williams wouldn't be able to hold them off much longer with just his pistol. Marcus identified the nearest threat, 3 Taliban fighters advancing along a shallow ravine that would bring them within grenade range of the American position. He pulled the pin on his first fragmentation grenade, counted off the proper timing, and threw it with accuracy born of countless hours of training. The explosion scattered the 3 fighters and bought Williams a few more minutes. But Marcus could see other enemy elements maneuvering to flank the American position from different directions. He keyed his radio while moving to his next firing position. Williams, I'm 50 meters up the slope from your position. When I open fire, grab Patterson and move to those rocks on your left. Can you carry him? Roger that. Patterson still breathing but unconscious. Marcus positioned himself behind another boulder and began engaging the Taliban fighters systematically. His M4 carbine wasn't as accurate at distance as his sniper rifle, but at ranges under 200 meters, he could still place shots precisely where they needed to go. His first burst caught a Taliban marksman who had been drawing a bead on Williams' position. The second burst forced a group of advancing fighters to take cover behind inadequate rocks, disrupting their coordinated assault. But engaging multiple targets revealed Marcus's position to the enemy, and return fire immediately began impacting around his cover. He had perhaps 30 seconds before the Taliban fighters adjusted their fire and made his current position untenable. Williams, move now! Marcus watched as Williams hefted Patterson over his shoulder in a fireman's carry and began moving towards better cover. The sergeant was strong, but carrying an unconscious man across rocky terrain while under fire was exhausting work. A Taliban fighter popped up from behind a low wall and aimed his AK-47 at the moving Americans. Marcus engaged him immediately, his 3-round burst spinning the enemy fighter around and dropping him behind the wall. Williams reached the rocky outcropping Marcus had indicated and got Patterson into cover. From that position, the wounded soldier would be protected from most enemy fire angles, and Williams could defend the position more effectively. Good move, Marcus radioed. Stay tight. Air support should be here any minute. As if summoned by his words, Marcus heard the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters. 2 Apache gunships were coming in fast and low, their 30mm chain guns already seeking targets in the village below. Through his earpiece, he could hear Danny directing the Apache crews. Tally-ho! On multiple vehicles in the village center, engaging now. The sound of the Apache's chain guns was like nothing else in modern warfare. A deep mechanical roar that could put 30 rounds on target in 2 seconds. Marcus watched as the lead gunship engaged the Taliban vehicles that had been bringing reinforcements. The psychological effect was immediate. Taliban fighters who had been advancing aggressively suddenly found themselves exposed to attack, helicopter gun runs. Many began withdrawing toward the village, seeking better cover against air attack, but the most experienced fighters, the ones closest to the American positions, continued their advance. These were veterans who had fought against coalition air power before and knew that helicopters couldn't engage targets that were too close to friendly forces. Marcus found himself in exactly that situation. Several Taliban fighters were now close enough that the Apache crews couldn't engage them without risking American casualties. The final phase of this fight would have to be settled with small arms fire and close combat. A figure appeared from behind a rock formation only 30 meters away. Marcus recognized him immediately from intelligence photographs. Ahmed Khalil himself, armed with an AK-74 and moving with the practiced grace of an experienced combat soldier. The Taliban commander hadn't fled to safety when the shooting started. He was personally leading the assault on the American positions, putting himself at the same risk as his fighters. Marcus raised his M4 and placed the red dot sight on Khalil's center mass. This time, there were no children present, no moral ambiguity. This was pure tactical necessity. Enemy commander, active combat situation, clear threat to American lives. Marcus began his trigger squeeze, the same muscle memory that had served him through dozens of successful engagements. At this range, with this weapon, the shot was essentially automatic. But Ahmad Khalil chose that moment to look directly up the slope toward Marcus's position, and for the second time that day, their eyes met across the crosshairs of a weapon. The Taliban commander's expression wasn't fear or surprise, it was something closer to recognition, as if he had expected this moment from the beginning. Khalil raised his own weapon, not at Marcus but toward Williams and Patterson's position. The message was clear. If Marcus took the shot, the Taliban commander's dying reflex might still trigger a burst that could kill the wounded Americans. Marcus held his fire, trapped in another impossible tactical situation. Every second of hesitation allowed more Taliban fighters to close the distance. But taking the shot might cost his teammates their lives. In that moment of frozen calculation, Marcus realized that Ahmad Khalil was a far more dangerous enemy than he had initially understood. The Taliban commander wasn't just tactically sophisticated, he was psychologically sophisticated, capable of reading American decision-making processes and exploiting the moral complexity that came with fighting under rules of engagement. The battle had become as much about will and understanding as about firepower and position. And Marcus was beginning to suspect that he was facing an opponent who understood war in ways that went beyond the tactical manual. The standoff lasted only seconds, but to Marcus it felt like hours. Ahmad Khalil stood 30 meters away, his weapon trained on Williams and Patterson's position, while Marcus held his sights on the Taliban commander. Around them, the firefight continued with automatic weapons fire and the distant thunder of Apache helicopters engaging targets in the village below. Then everything changed. A young Taliban fighter, probably no older than 16, rose from cover behind Khalil and fired a wild burst from his AK-47. The kid was clearly inexperienced, holding the trigger down instead of firing controlled bursts, and his muzzle climbed with recoil until he was shooting into the sky. But one of those wild rounds found its mark in a way that trained marksmanship couldn't have achieved. Marcus felt the bullet punch into his left shoulder, spinning him sideways and dropping him behind the boulder that had been providing his cover. The impact felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. Marcus's M4 carbine clattered across the rocks, momentarily out of reach as his left arm went numb and unresponsive. Blood spread across his uniform blouse, and he could feel the warm wetness against his skin. Through the haze of pain and shock, Marcus heard Khalil shouting orders in Pashto. The Taliban fighters were moving again, taking advantage of the American sniper's vulnerability to close the final distance to both isolated positions. Marcus forced himself to assess his injury. The bullet had entered just below his left shoulder, probably missing the major arteries but definitely damaging muscle and possibly bone. His left arm was essentially useless, but he could still fight with his right hand. He retrieved his carbine and checked the action. Still functional, though he'd have to fire one-handed now. Not ideal for accuracy, but better than being completely defenseless. "Kane, report!" Danny's voice came through his earpiece, strained with concern. "I'm hit, but still in the fight," Marcus replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Blood loss would weaken him quickly, and fighting one-handed against multiple opponents was a losing proposition. Through the rocks he could see Williams trying to defend Patterson's position with his sidearm. The sergeant had maybe 2 magazines left for his pistol, nowhere near enough ammunition to hold off a determined assault by experienced fighters. The Apache helicopters were still working the village, but their effectiveness was limited by the proximity of friendly forces to enemy positions. Modern warfare's precision came with the cost of complexity. Sometimes the most advanced weapons in the world couldn't help when the fighting got close and personal. Marcus forced himself to move to a better position, ignoring the pain that shot through his shoulder with every motion. Behind a different boulder, he had a better view of the approaching Taliban fighters and cleaner shots at the most immediate threats. The young fighter who had wounded him was advancing recklessly, probably excited by his success and eager to finish off the American sniper. Marcus placed his red dot sight on the kid's chest and squeezed the trigger once. The young Taliban fighter dropped immediately, his rifle tumbling down the rocky slope. Marcus felt no satisfaction from the kill. The kid had been brave but stupid, probably convinced by older fighters that Americans were easy targets who relied too heavily on technology and air support. Now he was dead, because he believed the wrong people and made the wrong choices. But eliminating one threat only revealed others. Marcus counted at least 6 Taliban fighters still advancing on the American positions, including Ahmad Khalil himself. The Taliban commander was moving with tactical precision, using cover and concealment while directing his subordinates with hand signals. Marcus engaged another target, wounding a fighter who had exposed himself while trying to flank Williams' position. But the return fire was immediate and accurate, forcing Marcus to stay low behind cover. His left shoulder was getting worse. The pain was manageable, but the blood loss was beginning to affect his vision and concentration. He needed medical attention soon, or he would become a liability rather than an asset in this fight. "Williams, how's your ammunition situation?" "Down to my last magazine," came the reply. "Patterson's still unconscious but breathing." Marcus did quick calculations. Williams had maybe 15 rounds left. Marcus himself had 2 magazines remaining for his carbine. Against 6 experienced fighters led by a skilled commander, those numbers weren't encouraging. The Apache helicopters had finished their gun runs on the village and were circling back toward the mountainside engagement. But Marcus knew they couldn't provide close air support without risking American casualties. The Taliban fighters had deliberately closed the distance to make air power ineffective. "Danny, can you see Khalil from your position?" Marcus radioed. "Negative. Too much terrain masking. But I've got eyes on 3 fighters moving up the ravine toward Williams." Marcus couldn't see the ravine from his current position, but he trusted Danny's spotting. Even wounded and operating with one good arm, his partner was still providing valuable intelligence. A new voice came through the radio, speaking with the authority of senior command. "All Bravo team elements, this is Colonel Morrison. Extraction helicopters are inbound. ETA 8 minutes. We need that landing zone secured." 8 minutes might as well have been 8 hours. The Taliban fighters would overrun both American positions long before extraction arrived. Marcus realized that the only way his team would survive was if someone could eliminate or disable Ahmad Khalil, disrupting the coordinated enemy assault. That someone would have to be him. Marcus studied the terrain between his position and where he'd last seen the Taliban commander. 50 meters of rocky slope with minimal cover, all of it under observation by enemy fighters. The tactical situation was almost identical to his earlier rescue attempt, except now he was wounded and facing even worse odds. But Williams and Patterson couldn't hold their position much longer, and Danny was isolated on the ridgeline with limited ammunition and a wounded arm. If Marcus didn't act soon, the mission would end with 4 American deaths and a significant Taliban propaganda victory. Marcus checked his remaining ammunition one more time. 2 magazines for his M4 plus his sidearm. Not much for a close-quarters battle against multiple opponents, but enough if he could eliminate the right targets in the right sequence. He keyed his radio for what might be the last time. "Danny, when I start moving, put fire on any targets of opportunity. Williams, be ready to displace to the extraction zone when I give you the signal. Kane, what are you planning?" Danny's voice carried understanding and concern. "Finishing the mission." Marcus didn't wait for a response. He rose from cover and began moving downslope toward the enemy positions, using speed and aggressive movement to close the distance before the Taliban fighters could coordinate their response. The first 20 meters were the longest of his life. Bullets cracked past his head and impacted the rocks around his feet, but none found their mark. Marcus fired short bursts at muzzle flashes, not expecting to hit anything but forcing enemy shooters to duck behind cover. A Taliban fighter rose from behind a boulder directly ahead, his AK-47 swinging toward Marcus. The American sniper put 2 rounds center mass before the enemy could complete his aimed shot. The fighter spun and fell, his weapon clattering down the mountainside. Marcus reached the cover of the boulder the Taliban fighter had been using and assessed his tactical situation. He was now deep in enemy territory, surrounded by fighters who knew the terrain better than he did. His wounded shoulder was bleeding more heavily from the physical exertion, and his vision was starting to blur around the edges. But he was also closer to Ahmed Khalil's last known position, and the Taliban fighters were reacting to his movement rather than executing their original plan. Sometimes aggressive action could disrupt a superior enemy force, even when the odds seemed impossible. A voice called out in accented English from somewhere nearby. "American sniper, you are surrounded. Surrender and your wounded will be treated properly." Marcus recognized Ahmad Khalil's voice, speaking with the confidence of someone who held all the tactical advantages. The Taliban commander was offering the traditional terms of surrender, probably hoping to capture rather than kill high-value American prisoners. Marcus didn't reply. Instead, he used the sound of Khalil's voice to locate the enemy commander's approximate position, 20 meters away, behind a cluster of rocks that offered good protection but limited visibility. Another Taliban fighter moved carelessly between positions, probably trying to get a better angle on Marcus's location. The American put a single round through the fighter's chest, dropping him instantly. But Marcus's return fire revealed his position to the remaining enemy fighters, and immediate accurate fire began impacting around his cover. At least 3 different shooters were engaging him now, their fire coordinated and disciplined. Marcus realized he was trapped in almost the exact same position that Williams and Patterson had been in earlier, surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. The only difference was that his aggressive movement had disrupted the Taliban assault long enough for his teammates to establish better defensive positions. Through his earpiece, he could hear the sound of approaching helicopters. The extraction aircraft were coming in ahead of schedule, probably because the Apache crews had reported the deteriorating tactical situation on the ground. "All Bravo team elements, this is Rescue 6, came a new voice. Landing zone is hot. We need immediate suppression of enemy positions for extraction." Marcus looked up toward the ridgeline where Danny was positioned. Even wounded, his spotter was engaging targets with the precision sniper rifle, forcing Taliban fighters to keep their heads down. Each shot Danny took was carefully aimed and effective, demonstrating the training and discipline that made Navy SEALs among the world's elite soldiers. Williams had used the distraction of Marcus's assault to move Patterson to a more defensible position, closer to the designated extraction point. The wounded soldier was still unconscious, but Williams had him positioned where the rescue helicopters could reach them quickly. Everything was working according to Marcus's desperate plan, except for one problem. He was still trapped in the middle of enemy positions with limited ammunition and no clear route to the extraction zone. Ahmad Khalil's voice called out again, closer this time. "You fought well, American, but this ends now." Marcus could hear movement from multiple directions as the remaining Taliban fighters closed in for the final assault. In 30 seconds, maybe less, they would have overwhelming fire superiority from multiple angles. Even elite training had limits when facing impossible odds. Marcus prepared for the fight he knew would be his last. 1 magazine left for his M4, plus his sidearm. Against trained fighters who knew these mountains like their own homes, led by a commander who had outmaneuvered him from the beginning of this mission. But as Marcus prepared to make his final stand, he heard something that changed everything. The high-pitched whine of an incoming missile, followed immediately by a massive explosion that shook the entire mountainside. The Apache helicopters had found a way to provide close air support after all. One of the gunships had fired a Hellfire missile at the cluster of rocks where Ahmad Khalil had been directing the assault, accepting the risk of American casualties in order to break the enemy's coordinated attack. The explosion scattered the remaining Taliban fighters and created the opening Marcus needed to reach the extraction zone. But it also revealed something he hadn't expected. Ahmad Khalil was still alive, crawling away from the destroyed position, with blood streaming down his face but his weapons still in his hands. The Taliban commander looked up and saw Marcus approaching, and their eyes met for the 3rd time that day. But this time, there were no hostages, no children, no moral complexity. Just 2 soldiers who had fought each other to a standstill and now faced the final moments of their engagement. Marcus raised his rifle, and Ahmad Khalil did the same. The question was no longer about tactics or strategy or moral ambiguity. It was about which warrior could pull the trigger first. Time seemed to slow as Marcus and Ahmad Khalil faced each other across 10 meters of blood-stained rock. Both men were wounded, exhausted, and down to their last reserves of strength. Around them, the mountain battlefield had gone eerily quiet, except for the distant sound of helicopters and the moans of wounded fighters scattered among the boulders. Marcus could see that the Hellfire missile had caught Khalil at the edge of its blast radius. The Taliban commander's left leg was clearly damaged, and blood ran down his face from multiple shrapnel wounds. But his hands remained steady on his AK-74, and his eyes showed no trace of fear or surrender. For a moment that stretched like eternity, neither man fired. They had been hunting each other all day across this desolate landscape, and now they found themselves in the most primitive form of combat, face to face, weapon to weapon, will against will. Marcus could see something in Khalil's expression that he recognized. It was the same look he'd seen in mirrors after difficult missions, the weight that came with being responsible for other men's lives and deaths. Khalil wasn't just a terrorist or an extremist. He was a soldier fighting for something he believed in, leading men who trusted him to bring them home alive. The realization didn't change the tactical situation. Khalil was still the enemy, still responsible for attacks that had killed American soldiers. But it added a layer of complexity that Marcus hadn't expected in his final confrontation. "Your men are dead or scattered," Marcus said in English. hoping Khalil would understand. "This doesn't have to end with both of us dying." Khalil's response came in heavily accented but clear English. "My daughter will ask what happened to her father. What should I tell her?" The question hit Marcus harder than any bullet could have. He thought of his own family back home, his sister Sarah, who worried about him through every deployment, his nephew Jake, who proudly told his classmates that his uncle was a Navy SEAL. What would happen to them if he didn't come home from this mountain? "Tell her you fought with honor," Marcus replied. "That's what I would want my family to know." Something shifted in Khalil's expression. For just a moment, the enemy commander seemed to see Marcus as more than just another American soldier to be killed. They were two men who had chosen the warrior's path, with all the sacrifices and moral complexity that choice entailed. But the moment of recognition couldn't change the fundamental reality of their situation. They were soldiers on opposite sides of a war, and war demanded its conclusions. The radio crackled in Marcus's earpiece. "Kane, extraction bird is on final approach. We need you at the landing zone now." Marcus could hear the rescue helicopter approaching, its rotors beating against the thin mountain air. Williams would be loading Patterson onto the bird, and Danny would be providing overwatch from the ridgeline. In 60 seconds, maybe less, the helicopter would lift off with or without him. Khalil heard the approaching aircraft too. His grip tightened on his weapon, and Marcus saw the decision forming in the Taliban commander's eyes. If he couldn't prevent the American extraction, he could at least ensure that one elite soldier wouldn't return to fight again. "Your helicopter," Khalil said quietly. "It will make a good target." The threat was clear. Even wounded and defeated, Khalil might still be able to engage the rescue aircraft with his rifle. Helicopter crews were vulnerable during landing and takeoff, when their aircraft became slow, predictable targets. Marcus realized that this confrontation was about more than just two soldiers settling their personal battle. If Khalil survived, he might be able to damage or destroy the extraction helicopter, potentially killing the aircrew and preventing the wounded Americans from receiving medical treatment. The tactical calculus was simple and brutal. Khalil had to be eliminated, not for revenge or even justice, but to protect the lives of Americans who were depending on Marcus to finish the mission. Marcus began to squeeze his trigger, accepting the weight of necessity. Ahmad Khalil was a father and a soldier, probably a man of honor according to his own cultural standards. But in this moment, on this battlefield, he was also an active threat to American lives. The rifle shot echoed across the mountainside, but it wasn't Marcus who fired. Danny's precision shot from the ridgeline took Khalil through the chest, the heavy sniper rifle round spinning the Taliban commander around and dropping him among the rocks where he'd made his final stand. The enemy leader's AK-74 clattered away, its threat permanently ended. Marcus lowered his own weapon, surprised by his own sense of relief. He had been prepared to kill Khalil, would have killed him if necessary, but he was glad that the final decision had been taken out of his hands. Through his earpiece, Danny's voice was calm and professional. Threat eliminated. "Kane, get to the extraction zone." Marcus looked down at Ahmad Khalil's still form. The Taliban commander's eyes were open, staring at the harsh Afghan sky he'd fought to defend. In death, his face looked younger, less burdened by the responsibilities of command and the weight of war. Marcus knelt briefly beside his fallen enemy and closed Khalil's eyes with his good hand. It was a small gesture of respect, soldier to soldier, that felt important despite the tactical urgency of the situation. "Thank you," Marcus whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was thanking the dead man for. Then he turned and began moving toward the extraction zone as quickly as his wounded condition would allow. Behind him, the mountain battlefield grew quiet as the surviving Taliban fighters melted away into terrain they knew better than any foreign army ever would. The rescue helicopter was a UH-60 Blackhawk with medical equipment and a flight surgeon aboard. Marcus could see Williams loading Patterson onto a stretcher while the crew chief provided covering fire toward the village below. The wounded soldier was conscious now, which was an encouraging sign. As Marcus approached the aircraft, he could see Danny moving down from the ridgeline, the heavy sniper rifle slung across his back, and his wounded arm pressed against his chest. The young spotter moved with the controlled urgency of someone who was badly hurt, but still functional. "Kane," Williams called out over the helicopter noise. "Patterson's stable, but we need to get him to a trauma surgeon fast." Marcus climbed aboard the Black Hawk and immediately felt hands pulling him into the cabin. The flight surgeon, a Navy lieutenant commander with steady hands and calm eyes, began examining his shoulder wound while the crew chief helped Danny aboard. "How bad?" Marcus asked as the doctor cut away his uniform blouse. "You'll live, but you need surgery to remove the bullet fragments. Probably some nerve damage, but nothing that won't heal with time and physical therapy." As the helicopter lifted off from the mountainside landing zone, Marcus looked down at the battlefield where 4 American soldiers had held off a superior enemy force and lived to tell about it. The village below looked peaceful again, as if the morning's violence had been nothing more than a bad dream. But Marcus knew that Ahmad Khalil's death wouldn't end the war, or even significantly change the tactical situation in this region. Other commanders would take his place. Other fighters would continue the insurgency. Other battles would be fought in these unforgiving mountains. What had changed was something harder to define. Marcus had learned something about himself during those hours under fire, something about the weight of command decisions and the moral complexity of warfare that couldn't be taught in any military school. He'd hesitated to take a shot because he'd seen humanity in his enemy. That hesitation had led to an ambush that nearly killed his entire team. But it had also led to a confrontation that revealed the honor and courage that existed on both sides of the conflict. Sergeant Kane, the flight surgeon, said as he worked on the shoulder wound, "The bullet missed all the major structures. You're going to make a full recovery." Marcus nodded his thanks but didn't reply. He was thinking about Khalil's daughter, the little girl who had unknowingly saved her father's life for a few hours by simply being a child who loved her father. Somewhere in the village below, she would learn that her father wasn't coming home. War created orphans on both sides. Through the helicopter's window, Marcus could see the Apache gunships still circling the area, ensuring that no surface-to-air missiles threatened the extraction. Professional, lethal, utterly committed to bringing American soldiers home alive. But even the most advanced military technology couldn't answer the questions that mattered most. Why did good men have to die? What was the true cost of victory? How did soldiers maintain their humanity while doing things that were fundamentally inhuman? Marcus closed his eyes and let the steady rhythm of the helicopter rotors carry him away from the mountain battlefield. He would return to the United States, heal from his wounds, and probably deploy again when his recovery was complete. Because that's what professional soldiers did. But he would carry the memory of this day forever. The weight of decisions made and unmade. The faces of enemies who were also fathers. The knowledge that courage and honor existed on both sides of every conflict, even when the cause seemed absolutely clear. As the helicopter flew toward the medical facility where American surgeons would repair his damaged shoulder, Marcus thought about the moment when he'd almost pulled the trigger on Ahmad Khalil. In that frozen instant, both men had recognized something in each other that transcended nationality and ideology. They had seen the warrior's burden that every professional soldier carried, the responsibility for life and death decisions that shaped not just military outcomes, but the moral landscape of their own souls. Some wars ended with clear victories and defeated enemies. But this war, Marcus was beginning to understand, would end with questions that had no easy answers. Questions about the price of peace and the weight of survival. Questions that every warrior had to answer for himself, alone with his conscience and his memories. The helicopter banked toward the setting sun, carrying 4 wounded American soldiers home from another day in a war that seemed to have no end. Below them, the mountains of Afghanistan kept their ancient secrets, waiting for the next group of young men who would come to test themselves against the harsh realities of combat. In the distance, Marcus could see the lights of the forward operating base where they would land, where American doctors would save lives and American officers would write reports about tactical successes and mission accomplishments. But those reports would never capture what really happened on the mountain that day. They would never describe the moment when a sniper hesitated because he saw a father embracing his daughter. They would never explain the weight of mercy in a profession that demanded none. Those truths belonged to the soldiers who had lived them. And Marcus Kane would carry those truths for the rest of his life, however long that might be. 6 months later, Marcus Kane stood in his sister Sarah's backyard in suburban Virginia, watching his 8-year-old nephew Jake attempt to climb the old oak tree they had both conquered in their own childhoods. The boy's determination reminded Marcus of himself at that age, absolutely convinced that any obstacle could be overcome with enough persistence and courage. "Uncle Marcus, watch this!" Jake called out as he reached for a branch that was clearly too high for his short arms to reach safely. "Careful there, Ranger," Marcus replied, moving closer to spot the boy in case he fell. "Sometimes the smartest move is to find a different route to your objective." Jake considered this advice seriously before working his way around to the other side of the tree, where lower branches offered a more manageable approach to his goal. It was a small lesson in tactical thinking that the boy absorbed naturally. Marcus flexed his left shoulder, feeling the familiar ache that reminded him daily of that mountain in Afghanistan. The military surgeons had done excellent work. He had full range of motion and strength, cleared for full duty with no permanent limitations, but some wounds left scars that went deeper than muscle and bone. "You're thinking about it again," Sarah said, emerging from the house with 2 cups of coffee. At 34, she was 2 years older than Marcus and had spent most of her adult life worrying about her little brother's chosen profession. Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully. Sarah made it strong and black, the way he'd learned to drink it during long nights on patrol bases where sleep was a luxury and caffeine was a necessity. "Thinking about what?" "Whatever happened over there that you won't talk about. You get that look sometimes, like you're seeing something the rest of us can't see." Marcus watched Jake successfully reach the branch he'd been aiming for, his face bright with accomplished pride. The boy reminded Marcus of Danny Rodriguez, his former spotter, who had that same combination of determination and optimism that made excellent soldiers. Danny was doing well, according to their last conversation. The young SEAL had been promoted to staff sergeant and was currently training new snipers at the Naval Special Warfare Center. His wounded arm had healed completely, and he'd volunteered for another deployment rotation. Williams and Patterson had both recovered from their injuries and remained on active duty. Patterson spent 2 months in military hospitals recovering from his chest wound, but the shrapnel had missed his heart and major vessels. Williams had written Marcus a letter thanking him for the rescue attempt, though Marcus still wasn't sure the tactical risk had been justified. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Joining the teams, I mean. All those deployments, all that time in places where people want to kill you." It was a question Marcus had been asked before by reporters, by military psychologists, by well-meaning civilians who couldn't understand why anyone would choose such a dangerous profession.
The answer was complicated and had evolved over the years.
"No," Marcus said finally. "I don't regret serving. But I've learned that the job changes you in ways you don't expect when you're young and think you have all the answers." Sarah nodded. She had seen him change over the course of 4 deployments. Watched him become more thoughtful and less certain about the simple, moral equations he'd believed in as a new SEAL. War had a way of complicating every certainty except the most basic one, the obligation to protect the people who mattered. "Jake's teacher wants to interview you for their Veterans Day presentation," Sarah said. "Something about heroes and service to country." Marcus winced slightly. He'd done a few of these school presentations over the years, and they always left him feeling like a fraud. Children wanted simple stories about good guys defeating bad guys, but Marcus's experiences didn't fit neatly into those categories. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that kind of presentation." "Why not? You've been awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with V-Device, multiple Navy Achievement Medals. You're exactly the kind of hero those kids should hear about." The medals were locked in a drawer in Marcus's apartment, rarely looked at and never displayed. Each one represented a specific action or mission, specific moments when training and circumstances had combined to produce outcomes that military bureaucrats decided were worthy of recognition. But Marcus knew that heroism was more complicated than medal citations suggested. Real heroism often involved decisions that never appeared in official reports, moments of moral choice that determined not just tactical outcomes but the kind of person a soldier became. "Heroes," Marcus said carefully, "are usually just people who were in the right place to do what needed to be done. Most of the time, the real heroes are the people who don't come home to receive medals." Sarah studied her brother's face, recognizing the weight he carried even when he tried to hide it. She'd seen this same expression on the faces of other veterans who had been changed by experiences they couldn't fully share with the civilian world. "Jake idolizes you," she said. "You know that, right? He tells his friends that his uncle is a Navy SEAL sniper who protects America from bad guys." Marcus looked up at his nephew, still working his way through the oak tree's branches with methodical determination. The boy had no conception of what war actually looked like, what it cost the people who fought it, or how rarely the good guys and bad guys were as clearly defined as comic books suggested. "What should I tell him when he gets older and asks what I actually did over there?" Sarah considered the question seriously. As a mother, she wanted to protect her son from the harsh realities of adult responsibility. But as Marcus's sister, she understood that some truths couldn't be avoided forever. Tell him that you served with honor. Tell him that you protected people who couldn't protect themselves. Tell him that freedom isn't free and somebody has to be willing to pay the price. Those were the kinds of answers that satisfied most civilians. The patriotic platitudes that allowed people to support the military without thinking too deeply about what military service actually required. But Marcus knew that the real answers were more complicated. He had killed people, not just enemy combatants in active firefights, but human beings with families and hopes and fears of their own. Each death had been tactically justified and legally authorized. But that didn't eliminate the moral weight that came with ending someone else's existence. He had made decisions under extreme pressure that affected not just his own survival, but the lives of the men who served with him. Sometimes those decisions had been correct. Sometimes they had been wrong. Always they had carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Most importantly, he had learned that war was not primarily about defeating enemies or accomplishing strategic objectives. War was about the bonds between soldiers who depended on each other for survival in situations where normal moral rules had been suspended by necessity. Danny Rodriguez understood that. So did Williams and Patterson. They had shared experiences that created connections deeper than family relationships, forged by circumstances that civilian life could never replicate. "Uncle Marcus," Jake called from his perch in the oak tree, "can you teach me how to shoot?" Sarah gave Marcus a sharp look, but he held up his hand diplomatically. "When you're older, Ranger, and only if your mum says it's okay. There are important things to learn about firearm safety and responsibility before anyone picks up a weapon." Jake accepted this condition with the patience that children show when adults promise future privileges. But Marcus knew that the boy would remember this conversation and eventually ask for the promised training. When that time came, Marcus would teach Jake about marksmanship and weapon safety. But more importantly, he would try to teach him about the weight that came with the power to take life, the responsibility that every person carried to use that power only when absolutely necessary. The phone in Marcus's pocket buzzed with an incoming text message. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from his commanding officer. "New deployment rotation available." Interested, Marcus stared at the message for a long time. He could return to Afghanistan or deploy to another combat zone where his skills would be needed. There would always be missions that required experienced snipers, always situations where precision fire could save American lives. But he could also remain stateside and train the next generation of warriors, passing on the tactical knowledge and hard-earned wisdom that might help them survive their own encounters with the moral complexity of modern warfare. "Work?" Sarah asked, noticing his distraction. "Maybe. I haven't decided yet." Marcus typed a reply. "Need time to think about it." "We'll get back to you in 48 hours. He put the phone away and focused on Jake's continued progress up the oak tree. The boy had reached his goal and was now carefully working his way back down, using the same methodical approach that had gotten him to the top safely. "Good job, Ranger," Marcus called out. "Remember that coming down can be harder than going up. Take your time." The advice applied to more than tree climbing. Marcus had spent years learning how to be an elite warrior, how to operate in the most dangerous environments on Earth, how to make life and death decisions under extreme pressure. Coming down from that intensity, readjusting to civilian life and peacetime routines, presented its own challenges. Some soldiers never managed the transition successfully. They remained deployed emotionally even when they were physically back home, constantly scanning for threats and maintaining the hypervigilance that kept them alive in combat zones. Marcus had seen too many good soldiers struggle with that readjustment. Some turned to alcohol or drugs to manage the stress. Others became isolated from family and friends who couldn't understand their experiences. A few took their own lives rather than continue fighting battles that existed only in their memories. He was determined not to become another casualty of that invisible war. Jake reached the ground safely and ran over to his uncle with the excitement of shared accomplishment. "Did you see? I made it all the way to the top branch." "I saw, Ranger." "Outstanding work. You showed patience and good judgment up there." Jake beamed with pride at the praise, then looked up at Marcus with serious eyes. "Uncle Marcus, were you scared when you were in the war?" Sarah started to intervene, probably to redirect the conversation away from topics she considered too adult for her son, but Marcus held up his hand gently. "Yes, Jake, I was scared sometimes. But being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what you have to do even when you are scared." Were the bad guys scared too? Marcus thought about Ahmad Khalil, dying on a mountainside far from his home and his daughter. Yes, I think they were. Most people are scared in dangerous situations. That's normal and healthy. Jake processed this information with the seriousness that children bring to important questions. "Will you have to go back and fight more bad guys?" "I don't know yet, Ranger. That's something I have to decide." Marcus looked up at the oak tree Jake had just conquered, its branches reaching toward a clear Virginia sky that held no threats, no hidden snipers, no mortar rounds or rocket-propelled grenades. The peace felt almost surreal after years of deployments where danger was a constant presence. But he knew that peace was maintained by people who were willing to go to dangerous places and do difficult things. Freedom required guardians, and guardians had to be prepared to pay the price that freedom demanded. The question was whether Marcus Kane was ready to pay that price again, or whether it was time to find other ways to serve his country and the people he cared about. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Sarah's backyard, Marcus realized that some decisions couldn't be rushed. The warrior's path had brought him to this moment of choice, but the next step would define not just his future, but the kind of person he would become. Looking at his nephew's trusting face, Marcus understood that whatever choice he made would ripple through generations, affecting not just his own life, but the lives of people who looked up to him for guidance and protection. The weight of that responsibility felt familiar. It was the same weight he'd carried on every deployment, in every firefight, with every decision that had brought him safely home to this peaceful backyard where a boy could climb trees without fear, and a sister could worry about normal things like school presentations and career decisions. Some burdens were worth carrying. Some prices were worth paying. Marcus Kane still had time to decide which burdens were his to bear,